On January 5, 1942, as Tokyo celebrated early victories, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Combined Fleet, initiated plans for the Pacific War's second stage. His intelligence indicated a swift Japanese takeover of East Asia within months. He pressed his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, for plans by mid-February. The rapid Japanese expansion astonished Tokyo planners and sparked internal disagreements within the Imperial General Staff. While ardent nationalists advocated for continued aggression, Yamamoto, who had harbored reservations about war with the U.S. and Britain, was concerned about the long-term prospects. His presence at sea aboard the Yamato underscored his friend's fears of assassination if he remained in Tokyo, given his public opposition to unlimited war. Yamamoto's concerns were not new. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, he had met with ultra-nationalist leader Ryoichi Sasakawa, warning that political decisions made war inevitable. He predicted initial Japanese successes, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles, a reality that had already largely materialized just a month into the war. However, Yamamoto also cautioned that this euphoria would be short-lived. He believed that the fall of Singapore would be the opportune moment for political action, anticipating that this disaster would compel the British to consider peace. His understanding of Western powers stemmed from his participation in the London naval conferences and his role as Japanese naval attaché in Washington. He believed a swift, decisive victory was necessary at the war's outset, but emphasized that Japan would have only about 18 months to leverage this glory for a peace agreement. He tasked Sasakawa with conveying this message to the right-wing political leadership. By January 5th, victory seemed within reach. The U.S. battleship fleet was crippled at Pearl Harbor. British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales sunk, Manila and Cavite captured, and Hong Kong surrendered. Japanese forces were poised for new landings in the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, New Ireland, Amba, and the Solomon Islands. Yet Pearl Harbor hadn't achieved Yamamoto's primary goal, the destruction of the U.S. aircraft carriers, which remained an active threat. He sought a more spectacular achievement, not expecting Singapore to fall for another 5 or 6 months. Believing a new direction was necessary for negotiations, he pressed his planners for the next strike. The Army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union due to their extensive engagements in China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternative plans emerged. Yamamoto's favored option was an Indian Ocean offensive, invade Ceylon, draw out and destroy the British Far Eastern Fleet, and then advance into the Middle East to link with German forces driving towards Soviet oil fields, thus securing vital oil for the Japanese Navy. However, the Army rejected a Middle Eastern operation, leaving 2 remaining plans. One plan, advocated by the Naval General Staff, called for an attack on Australia to deny the Americans a forward operating base. This involved taking New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa after moving into the Solomon Islands. Imperial General Headquarters was already preparing occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. However, Yamamoto disliked this plan, deeming it too slow and not spectacular enough to deter the Americans. He understood that the Pearl Harbor attack had ignited a spirit of vengeance in the Americans, whom the Japanese had erroneously dismissed as soft. The capture of Singapore, he realized, would not be enough. Yamamoto desired a victory grand enough to facilitate a generous olive branch of peace. In January, Yamamoto ordered the drafting of a new plan. 2 months later, officers brought him the Me Plan, which envisioned a decisive battle off Midway Island to destroy the American carrier force. He also presented the AL Plan, detailing an invasion of the North American continent via Alaska with the eventual occupation of Hawaii and possibly the U.S. West Coast. Victories at Midway and in the Aleutians, he believed, would provide the politicians with a strong negotiating position. Despite initial squabbles among admirals in Tokyo, Yamamoto's vision prevailed. The potential significance of Singapore's fall in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor were overshadowed. The turning point came with Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber raid on Tokyo in April. This audacious strike shocked the Japanese, revealing the true American fighting spirit. In June, the disastrous Battle of Midway, a defeat concealed from many in the Army, further underscored the shifting tide. While Yamamoto was preoccupied with Midway, The Naval General Staff in Tokyo was steadily advancing naval and air forces southward to cut off Australia. Rabaul was taken on January 23rd, and constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids followed against other islands in New Guinea. Australians, communicating their fears to General Douglas MacArthur, anticipated a Japanese move against New Guinea, which, if successful, could lead to an easy takeover of northern Australia. Darwin had already been bombed in February, and the pace intensified with the invasion of Salamaua. New Guinea in March. In May, just before Midway, a Japanese occupation force aiming for Port Moresby was repelled by fierce American and Australian defense in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did, however, occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and established a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia of the need to prepare for a Japanese thrust southward. MacArthur urged the Australian government to be ready for an attack and cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. However, in May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed Marshall that only 2 operational carriers would be available in the Pacific until the end of June. At the same time, the Japanese had 10 carriers on the eve of Midway, and Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already warned of a major Japanese offensive, which proved to be Midway. While events unfolded at Midway, the Japanese established forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force landed at Salamaua, and naval troops occupied Lae, beginning to build an airbase. Independently of Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff planned the Port Moresby operation, ordering Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake to advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the Port Moresby offensive by July, after Yamamoto's expected return with the combined fleet. This massive carrier force was intended to protect the new advance. Despite the defeat at Midway, reported as a victory to field forces, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans. Days after Midway, Australia informed MacArthur that the Japanese were poised to move. Leveraging the perceived Midway victory, MacArthur proposed an Allied preemptive strike on the New Britain-New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese base. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur aimed to push the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12th, General Marshall presented MacArthur's plan with modifications to Admiral King, requesting 3 carriers, 1 Marine division, and 3 Army divisions. King opposed the plan, primarily because it would put MacArthur in command of the fighting. His other concerns included the vulnerability of carriers to land-based attacks and insufficient protection, problems the Navy would later face at Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides led by Navy Command. MacArthur resisted having his army forces serve under the Navy, but the urgency of stopping the Japanese advance before they took New Guinea and threatened Australia was undeniable. The Joint Chiefs of Staff faced a command dilemma. They assigned Phase 1, the capture of the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi and adjacent positions, to Admiral King, Guadalcanal, then just an unnamed spot on the map, held no known tactical or strategic value in this initial JCS plan. MacArthur was given a consolation prize. After Phase 1, he would take over and clear the Japanese from the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King's plan prevailed because the JCS recognized his existing defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia, which required relatively fewer forces than MacArthur's proposal. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had convinced General Arnold to send several squadrons of U.S. Army Air Force planes there. He reinforced Samoa and Ifat in the New Hebrides and planned a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had irked King, was reassigned to the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego, with Marine Major General Holland Smith to develop new island warfare techniques. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested a 2-stage approach. First, hold the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. Second, a combined offensive by the U.S., Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. A third stage would seize the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and a fourth would take the Allies to either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. King approved, aligning perfectly with his own vision. He arranged for Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command, and detached Rear Admiral Turner to prepare as commander of the amphibious operation. This planning unfolded even before the Japanese assaults on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1st, slated to command the South Pacific Force on June 19th. But first, he reported to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already underway. On May 22nd, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft over Guadalcanal, prompting Army intelligence to suggest airfield construction. On June 25th, Army intelligence reported burnt-off grass, erected tents, and wharf construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal confirmed airfield construction, awaiting the arrival of Japanese 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American Seabees. This was corroborated by a radio interception from Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor, who had partially broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Turner, then visiting Pearl Harbor en route to prepare for an amphibious landing in the South Pacific, understood his destination, the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, tasked with training an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner mobilized ships and men, Admiral Gormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley's mind was filled with gloom regarding the foolishness of an amphibious operation without adequate training. MacArthur, who also disliked the plan, fully agreed. Both also concluded that existing air power could not guarantee sufficient air coverage for the landings, which were only 3 weeks away. This meeting occurred on July 18th. They dispatched a recommendation to Washington to defer the operation. But King, having warned Gormley of the difficulty and lack of resources until possibly the fall, refused. The invasion would proceed as planned. Gormley, having left Washington convinced the U.S. was unprepared for aggressive action in the South Pacific, grew more despondent when his efforts to immediately secure Seabees and other units for New Zealand failed. From its inception, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was plagued by intelligence failures. All commands knew an operation was imminent, especially after July 10th when Nimitz issued Gormley's orders. Rabaul, the major Japanese airbase, posed a significant threat as planes could refuel at Guadalcanal and bomb Australia, potentially crippling the Allied buildup. However, on July 10th, Allied intelligence reports reaching King only casually mentioned airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later, a report mislocated the field. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield, and Admiral Yamamoto, at Combined Fleet Headquarters, ordered the first staged mission to depart Rabaul on August 14th. As overall commander, Admiral Gormley desperately sought more help to build advanced bases and acquire more planes. But everywhere he turned, he confirmed King's assertion that he wouldn't receive proper tools. Supplies for the invasion, for example, were haphazardly loaded onto transports at Oakland, which had ample docks for proper loading. Instead, ships were sent to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. King, despite a general awareness of the difficulties, recognized the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia, allowing no time for delay. The timetable remained unchanged. By late July, the rush was on, with 17,000 Marines moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a commander's conference. But on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, slated for tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, tactical unit commanders met to discuss the invasion. Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force, while Admiral Turner would deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift. Once the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would be brought in, but the operation was so hastily conceived that no reserve troops were allotted, as none were available in the South Pacific. The Saratoga meeting was tense. Fletcher announced he would only protect the Guadalcanal landings for 2 days, insisting, with the concurrence of Gormley's staff members present, that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher, still shaken from the Coral Sea battle, believed the entire operation was ill-conceived, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, possessing a broader understanding of the global military situation than anyone else in the cabin, chastised Fletcher, arguing that such complaints were pointless. The decision was made, and their job was to execute orders. Fletcher should have known this. After Coral Sea, King had been so displeased with Fletcher's avoidance of action that he had ordered Nimitz to assess Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kind man who liked Fletcher, had given him a pep talk, and Fletcher's command at Midway had been beyond reproach. However, on the eve of the first American offensive, to inform troops and support ships of a planned withdrawal within 48 hours was an inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion took place on July 28th and lasted 3 days on Coro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and once there, they were disoriented. General Vandegrift considered the exercise a complete failure, but there was no time for re-evaluation. On July 31st, the Marines were back aboard transports heading for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the 75-ship task force neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously detached his carriers. His planes would provide air cover as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were kept as far from danger as possible. While American intelligence failed to prevent the Japanese airfield buildup on Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even worse. As the U.S. invasion fleet amassed, the Japanese had no inkling of an impending attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was focused on capturing New Guinea as a staging point for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buna, planning to build airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. Consequently, Japanese air power in July was concentrated against Port Moresby, with daily bomber and fighter raids. Japanese air forces were also tasked with supporting the Buna beachhead, and in early August, their attention was fixed on this new offensive. The combined Australian and American Air Force responded with raids on Japanese air bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored leisurely at Hashima, Japan, as he prepared for future air operations over Australia and to determine the next course of action. On August 3rd, naval air groups at Lae were recalled to Rabaul for the Guadalcanal operations scheduled to begin the following week. During the first week of August, cloudy South Pacific skies limited Japanese search planes, and none detected the American armada steaming towards Guadalcanal. Japanese airmen flying from Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft around Buna, having been told U.S. carriers were destroyed at Midway. They assumed these carriers were operating with Australian forces that had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected an imminent invasion. After 8 months of continuous victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to believe the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they would have agreed with MacArthur and Gormley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success. Thus, the American Expeditionary Force enjoyed the element of surprise as it moved towards Guadalcanal. On August 4th and 5th, the 75 ships steamed under an overcast sky, and on August 6th, the fleet navigated through rain squalls almost all day. But as dawn broke on August 7th, the sky cleared, ensuring good visibility for carrier plane attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 a.m., and at 6 a.m., the carriers launched their first strike. Planes from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo connected by a causeway. Bad weather had grounded Japanese planes the previous day. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but its origin, Japanese or MacArthur's command, was unknown. In any event, the Japanese were not alerted until 6:12 a.m. when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message, "Enemy heavy bombardment in progress," reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial headquarters. The clear weather allowed carrier planes to fly through scattered cumulus clouds under a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers proceeded to their missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft or PT boats, but strafed buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 Enterprise fighters maintained a combat air patrol over the transports from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. when they were replaced. Bombers began hitting Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was sighted all morning. The Americans had unchallenged air superiority, with only operational accidents causing plane damage. Planes from other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu, achieving complete surprise. American planes bombed and strafed the seaplanes in the water, destroying 9 Zero-like float planes, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that also served as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots attempting takeoff were shot down before becoming airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi, with some targeting beaches where Marines would soon land. Before dawn, Marines on the transport's decks could see the high mountains of their objective island. The transport slipped through the narrow channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sealark Channel. As dawn rose, escorting warships fired, their flashes illuminating the fleet. There was virtually no return fire. The bombardment from cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop ships started fires along the shore, and an oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping skyward. At 8:00 a.m., after 2 hours of bombing and shelling, landing craft moved towards the north shore, east of Lunga Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had practical experience in such a landing, as this was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 a.m., troops landed on Guadalcanal, encountering no resistance as the Japanese had fled into the hills. The advance was remarkably easy. The Marines quickly realized the extent of their surprise, finding untouched wooden barracks, a tent with a breakfast table laden with platters of meat, rice, and cooked plums, and half-filled rice bowls and hastily dropped chopsticks. The condition of the tents, torn by shrapnel and flattened by naval shelling, explained the rapid Japanese departure. However, any Marine celebrating this easy initial success was in for a shock. While the Japanese on Guadalcanal were surprised and hadn't dug in or created permanent fortifications, most were construction troops, not combatants. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines on Tulagi faced stout resistance. Approximately 250 experienced and dedicated Japanese fighters from the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Haseki Miyazaki were stationed on Tulagi. Edson's 1st Raiders, chosen from the toughest American troops in the Pacific, were all volunteers. The Raider concept originated from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for a commando force, drawing from his experience with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army's guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for months under Spartan conditions, arriving at Guadalcanal with a formidable reputation. As it turned out, they would need every skill learned and would quickly acquire new ones. This invasion marked the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese, with a reputation even more fearsome than the Raiders due to their rapid conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, had fostered a belief in their invincibility, a reputation the Imperial High Command was eager to maintain. Tulagi, then, became the first true testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island, initially finding the going no harder than on Guadalcanal, encountering only light resistance from a few outposts. The northwest of Tulagi was covered in thick jungle, small trees, vines, and thorny bougainvillea. Initially, the terrain seemed the greatest obstacle. Edson lost only 1 man to a sniper. Upon hitting the beach, Edson planned to move inland to a ridge running the length of the island, then clear the slopes while advancing south along it. However, the terrain was so challenging that it took 3 hours for the men to hack their way through 1.5 miles of rising ground. Reaching the ridgeline, the Marines emerged from the jungle and ran directly into the central Japanese defenses built into the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock embrasures, carefully positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. Their defense strategy relied on maintaining the high ground. However, the Marines discovered they could crawl up the cliffs and drop dynamite charges and grenades into the dugouts. a method they had to adopt for any advance. Even after a dugout was blown, it remained dangerous. In one hole, Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite. A Marine spotted a radio inside and entered to retrieve it, only to be shot by 2 surviving Japanese soldiers, who also killed another Marine before they themselves were killed. While one section of Marines engaged this central defense, the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. Even along the ridgeline, the advance was difficult. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. Beyond frontal resistance, which was fierce, Japanese snipers were ubiquitous, concealed in trees, on rooftops, and behind rocks. A common sniper tactic was to let the lead elements of a Marine unit pass before firing from behind. This often meant death for the sniper, but usually inflicted several casualties. The first raiders learned that day that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slugs were more likely to wound than to kill, which was strategically advantageous for the Japanese as it tied up additional Allied troops and resources caring for the wounded. Throughout the afternoon, the raiders advanced along the ridge until they reached a 3-sided ravine, whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls, establishing the familiar fields of fire that would define later months of fighting. As Marines approached, they encountered intense crossfire, and Edson halted the advance as darkness fell, deeming it too risky to probe unknown dangers at night. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced another new and terrifying aspect of Japanese warfare. Knowing they were outnumbered and without hope of survival, the Japanese launched one of the desperate counterattacks that would become their infamous signature. They waited until the Marine perimeter was quiet. Then, at 10:30 p.m., they breached the line between 2 companies, surrounding one. Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese advanced along the ridge towards Colonel Edson's command post, coming within 50 yards. Finally, the Marines overwhelmed the Japanese and repelled them, but not before one company lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, more troops landed on Tulagi, bringing the total to 7,500 on that side of Sea Lark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines resumed their advance towards the southeastern end of the island. They systematically attacked the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep slopes of the old cricket ground. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already decomposing, others killed in the final moments of defense. From this, the Americans correctly deduced the Japanese tactic of holding a position to the last man unless ordered to retreat, a testament to the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those who surrendered on Guadalcanal were primarily labor battalion members, not combat troops. On this second day, the raiders encountered numerous examples of a spirit they had not previously witnessed. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who, in the end, possessed only one loaded pistol. As Marines prepared for the final assault, they heard 3 shots. Upon entering the dugout, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. In these early days, this suicidal attitude stunned the Marines. It was difficult for Americans to comprehend how cornered or wounded men, with no hope of survival, knowing the enemy's overwhelming material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death over surrender. It took time to adjust, but after a few instances of Japanese feigning surrender, only to draw weapons or bayonets, or exploding grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, the Marines adapted. Thereafter, attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender virtually ceased. Tulagi was brought under control on that second day, though not all Japanese on the island were killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed American troops until the last one was eliminated. The stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi is exemplified by Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss's experience. He advanced ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field, from which the Japanese had fired sporadically. He moved close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave. Marines were trained to pull the pin, count slowly, and listen for the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, counted to 6, and the grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, forcing him to duck his own weapon's blast. After an identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, threw it, and counted 4, 5, 6, and it was thrown out again. Sergeant Goss then called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite typically used to blow up buildings. He primed the charge, thrust it into the cave, and retreated slightly. The Japanese thrust the charge back out of the cave mouth. The dynamite exploded, sending a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound, while not serious enough to incapacitate him, infuriated him. He grabbed his submachine gun and rushed into the cave, spraying fire, killing 4 Japanese soldiers and counting 8 others who had died earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was even more brutal than on Tulagi. Landings there occurred in the middle of the morning, with fewer troops committed as minimal Japanese resistance was expected. However, because the seaplane base was located on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines encountered significant trouble. Though surprised and still recovering from the bombardment and aerial attack that destroyed their seaplanes, the first troops ashore were met only by rifle fire. But by the time the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized themselves about 500 yards back, and the fire became intense. The third wave came under fire before their landing craft even reached shore, resulting in heavy casualties. Gavutu and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but this elevation above sea level landings was sufficient. The Japanese had built their defenses along the slopes, well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken. They did not retreat. The viciousness of the fighting on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable. In the early waves, Marines had landed tanks. The Japanese surged towards the Tanambogo dock where the landings occurred, jamming crowbars under the treads, throwing grenades, and attempting to ignite the tanks with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened his hatch and used the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one clambered up the side of the tank and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese soldier then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside, and the tank burned. By mid-afternoon on this first day, it was clear that the Marines needed reinforcements. A unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was called in to assist. Tanambogo had been taken, but the Marines were unable to secure the causeway linking the 2 small islands. The reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo, and at dusk they received 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach, illuminating the shore as if it were noon. As the Marines approached, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. A steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire erupted from the dugouts on the hills. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller, causing the boat to veer around and head back out to sea. Subsequent boats followed suit, believing there had been a change of orders. Thus, the men of the 2 landed boats were stranded ashore, their only protection being the concrete pier. The Japanese fired continuously, and as the Americans returned fire, the Japanese quickly pinpointed their position by the tracers. Soon several men were down. One boat retreated, taking the wounded, and it was some time before the confusion was cleared and other boats began to land. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the unit leader, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 men hid in the brush and, under cover of darkness, escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese had withdrawn to their hillside positions. Eventually, they were extricated, but it was 4:00 a.m. on August 8th before another unit landed and secured the causeway. At the start of the fighting, there were 500 Japanese on the connecting islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. When the fighting ended, there were none. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the U.S. assault to Rabaul. This astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield just as pilots for early morning missions were preparing to take off for another day of harassing Australians on New Guinea. Orders were immediately canceled, and all available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before the planes could take off, they received unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then contact with Tulagi was lost, which could only mean the base had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for the strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 180 fighters accompanied them as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Buna Island, and then turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were detected by 4 Enterprise planes just after 1 p.m. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet when they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked, and Lieutenant V.P. Dease shot down one bomber. 4 others began to smoke and were listed as probables. However, after this initial run, the Zeros joined the fight and the F-4Fs broke off to take refuge in cloud cover, as instructed. They had been hit hard. 1 F-4F was shot down, and Lieutenant Dease's plane was so badly damaged that he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, encountering the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros quickly attacked 3 of the fighters, shooting down all 3 F-4Fs. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Dibb shot down 1 Betty. The first kill of a Zero was made by radio electrician T.W. Rhodes, but the Zeros then attacked in force, and the F-4Fs ducked into clouds to hide. 10 Zeros pursued them in 2 formations, adhering to the Japanese rule of never losing sight of their wingman. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard quarter, and Lieutenant Firebaugh, enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson, Jr., and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were shot down. A coast watcher rescued Firebaugh from the water off Santa Isabel Island, and a Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden from the same island. But Stevenson was not found. On the other carriers, the story was similar. The bombers were much easier targets. 6 fighters of Flight 323 encountered enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them, with machinist D.E. Runyon single-handedly destroying 2. Just after 2:30 a.m., when the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the islands, coast watchers were on alert. Paul Edward Mason, a peacetime copra planter stationed on Malab Hill on Bougainville, overlooking Buin, sent a message at 9:01 a.m. that 24 Japanese bombers were heading towards Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles, or 2¼ hours, away when that message was broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet, reaching the invasion fleet with ample time for preparations. The reaction of HMAS Canberra, an Australian cruiser, was typical. When the word came, the boatswain's mate piped, "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 Hu." The torpedo bombers arrived right on schedule. United States fighters climbed to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached Guadalcanal's north shore and looked down on the invasion fleet. At noon, American carrier fighters and ship guns were ready. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were experiencing the results of a counterattack. American fighter planes were highly effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that reached Guadalcanal, all but 1 were shot down. The only damage sustained in that first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, it was a different story. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among the 18 skilled pilots chosen for this first long-range mission. The Japanese force was intercepted by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, which attacked the bombers directly, largely ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros protected the bombers as best they could, then turned to engage the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. Navy pilots dove against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. This was due to excellent intelligence briefings, which informed them of the Zero's superior turning and climbing ability, as well as its speed. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down 1 F-4F and an SBD dive bomber that, by itself, engaged 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots made kills, while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai then attacked a group of SBD torpedo bombers, mistaking them for fighters, and flew directly into the fire of 4 spitting machine guns manned by rear gunners who had him in their sights. His Zero was badly damaged and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and land it before collapsing. The Japanese still held a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero, but American F-4F pilots were already learning to exploit the enemy's limitations. Control of the air was clearly going to be hotly contested. At this moment, the Americans had the advantage of proximity with carriers offshore, but the Japanese had superior numbers at Rabaul. The American effort was further hampered by the Zero's superiority over American fighters. Carrier pilots flew the F-4F Wildcat, which was neither as fast nor as maneuverable as the Zero, allowing Japanese planes to fly rings around them. The F-4F's sole advantage lay in its sturdy construction and armor protection, which helped keep American plane losses low. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion. However, the major challenge for Japanese fighters was the 1,100-mile round trip. For this reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the squadron leader, had resisted demands from higher authority to send all available Zeros into the fight, dispatching only his most experienced flyers. He would soon be forced to send others, and losses became more serious, largely due to the vast distances involved. By nightfall of the first day, the United States invasion seemed secure. American troops had advanced near the airfield, encountering no substantial resistance. One prisoner, captured, indicated only about 600 combat troops and 1,400 laborers on the island, who had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had landed 11,000 Marines, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandegrift noted that the beach force was unable to assimilate the supplies, but fearing the carriers would soon depart, he was relieved to see supplies still arriving. He established a second beachhead, but it soon became as crowded as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Red at Buin Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor repeated the broadcast to the ships. Carrier planes attacked and destroyed many enemy bombers, but on this day, U.S. ships did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber plunged into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott, setting it ablaze. Another dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, Enterprise planes and other carriers took off on their missions and found clear skies. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tanaru River and again worked over the airfield. At about 10 a.m., 3 Enterprise fighters discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the water to attack the transports. The Americans intercepted them. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter, Ensign V.H.H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. That marked the end of air activity for the day. At nightfall, Enterprise's Fighting 6 counted its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. Japanese Zero fighters still held an edge in experience and aircraft, but American pilots were already learning tricks of the trade. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group concluded that the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower and an inability to withstand punishment. Given the Zero's superior climb rate, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, F-4F pilots were warned to stick close together, and when attacked, each 2-plane element should execute a scissors movement, constantly turning towards each other. This allowed the pair of F-4Fs to concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy, confident their own planes could absorb significant damage. On the ground, Marines battled fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but secured control of the island by the end of the second day. The 250-man Japanese garrison fought to the last, with 200 killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swimming to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines suffered 250 casualties, and the 500-man Japanese garrison was wiped out to the last man. The ferocity of the fighting on Tulagi stood in stark contrast to the easy Marine advance on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, Marines reached the edge of the airport, which they would name Henderson Field after a flyer killed at Midway. They began to develop a contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine remarked within earshot of Richard Tregaskis, an International News Service correspondent. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines couldn't have asked for an easier war, but officers were edgy that second afternoon. It was too easy. At sea, the Americans apparently faced no opposition either. A few Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and 1 or 2 transports caught offshore were destroyed in the first hours of the invasion by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans pause. Most of those first waves of bombers were destroyed, but the cost of engaging the Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. This loss, while not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6 p.m. that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley for permission to withdraw his carriers. He withdrew before receiving a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized that the carrier withdrawal would leave him without any air cover. The number of Japanese planes he anticipated would increase sharply as the enemy brought in more aircraft through the island chain. As Fletcher began his withdrawal, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word invasion was flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa reacted immediately. Admiral Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, held responsibility for the entire South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them, with destroyer escort, to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. However, the convoy encountered the American submarine S-38, operating out of Australia following the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Mayo Maru with 342 men aboard. This sinking, coupled with reports of the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded Mikawa that it was too dangerous to attempt to reinforce the garrison, and he recalled the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa had been fortunate with timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers departed Kavieng on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 were headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin. When she arrived late that afternoon, she carried Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. Thus, the Japanese force moved towards Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa composed his battle plan. By reducing speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8th, launching a surprise night attack on American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew the Americans had several carriers in the area while he had none. A night attack guaranteed he would not be harassed by American planes, as the Americans had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, Americans had no record of competence in any sort of night naval operations. While this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty, Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to approach Guadalcanal without arriving too soon, yet still maintaining the element of surprise. He needed to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but a surprise attack would be enormously effective. The admiral did not know it then, but the divided command, the inferiority of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal relied solely on air search and submarine reports. Only under very special circumstances would Coast Watcher reports be useful for naval ship operations. Early in the day, the cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved towards Rabaul. On the evening of August 7th, the Mikawa force was sighted by the S-38 just as it emerged from St. George's Channel. That night, the commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane, but these 2 reports were not given much credence by American naval commanders because Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was normal for ships to move in and out. The Americans saw no indication that the ships in question were steaming towards Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for coordinating all elements of the American attack, but for air searches, he depended on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to search the Bismarck Islands, focusing on the large naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to monitor the northern approaches to the region, including Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to conduct short-range searches, but they conducted none at all. Preoccupied with Fletcher's worries, Admiral Turner had studied his charts and identified a superb approach for the Japanese to Guadalcanal Island. Along the west coast of Bougainville, directly down between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. This route was christened the Slot, soon to become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8th, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile triangular pattern whose apex was the Fiji Islands. They would come up almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands, ending at a point slightly above the Bismarcks but far to the west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs would spread out from Munda, across the Slot from Guadalcanal, to search an area north and west of the Slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7th, when Admiral Turner reviewed the search plan for the following day, he discovered the Slot was completely uncovered. He asked Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Munda, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans left uncovered the most obvious approach for any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal.